Started. All right, AV team, we ready? All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So weird to see people. Welcome to our event, California for All, towards a strategic plan for immigrant integration in the Golden State, presented by the Turpanjian Chair in Civil Society and Social Change. I am Dr. Kim Tabari, the Organizational Development Director at the University of Southern California, Dornsive Equity Research Institute. So thank you for spending your lunch with us to learn from some brilliant panelists who are community leaders, policymakers, and academics to envision the short and long-term future policies needed to move California towards an immigrant-inclusive state. This is also our first in-person hybrid event, mindful to take things slow as we emerge from the pandemic, and sending healing to those that have lost loved ones to COVID-19 and who may be experiencing sickness right now. Please continue to have safe practices as you move about in the world. To start today's conversation, I'd like to give a land acknowledgement. As part of USC's community, we acknowledge that the university is on the sacred land of the Tongva Nation. The colonization of this land reflects the systems of power upon which this country was founded and which continue to operate today. We honor the Tongva and all indigenous people past, present, and future for their continued survival and contributions to our society. We also honor the legacy of the African diaspora and recognize that this country would not have existed without the free, enslaved labor of Black people. We know that contemporary struggles for Black lives are connected to the history of violence and white supremacy. We share these acknowledgements to, 1, pay respects to the original caretakers of this land, 2, raise awareness about histories that are too often erased or forgotten, 3, to recognize our place in this history, and 4, to affirm our commitment to social change. Please take a moment to feel the ground underneath your feet and honor the land. For those of you online, if you're unsure what native land you may live in, you may check out native-land.ca as a great place to get started at figuring out what land you're on. Thank you for allowing us to get grounded and offer appreciations to the land and the original caretakers. Now it is my honor to introduce an amazing poet to open our hearts and minds. Yasmine Monet Watkins is a poet, comedian, writer, actress, educator, and organizer, all the things. Yasmine's body of work weaves art and activism, exploring the intersection of race, gender, sexuality, self-love, and all things Black girl magic. Please give a warm welcome to Yasmine Monet Watkins.
Thank you, Kim and USC, for inviting me to share a few poems with you as you start this very important work. One of the poems that I know Kim loves and that I think particularly speaks to this, what we're doing today, is called Borrowed Tongue. Sometimes I feel like I speak with a borrowed tongue. And the language of an oppressor, English does not feel like a place to call home. I imagine all the possible dialects I could have come from and trying Osa, try on Creole, like a young girl in her mother's clothes, too big, too complicated, more fabric weaved into all my flags than I know what to do with. And I don't fully understand why English feels like a foreign language when this is all I know of home. My race, class, gender, and sexuality, all reminders of why I am more second class than citizen, born in a country where my children are not safe from the law, with infrastructures built to oppress, feeling anything but home. I wear this red, white, and blue with trepidation. A wary outsider within, A complicated history whispers of forgotten stories, still lingering on the tongues of ancestors long gone, more question mark than origin story. I know nowhere is perfect. But all I've got for background is my grandparents' light skin, gene expressing in my own, from the South, without much collective memory. Our family tree has no crest, no tidy explanation of our generations, just blank, empty space where the roots used to be, wondering who was my grandmother's grandmother's mother and the mother's mothers before them. From what branch were they plucked? What languages did they leave back home? Where did they learn to speak? Sorry, not sorry, plantation ain't good enough. I wonder what my voice would sound like without the erasure, without the colonization. Sometimes I dream of flying places even my ancestors can't recall. A space where our true song and dance drums deep and our speech pattern rich with the floral rhythm of rolling R's and mango and spice. I am an orphan robbed from a dialect I will never get to move into. I wish I knew where my blood comes from. Perhaps that is why there is such an irresistible urge to travel, wander, lusting in my bones, always searching for some place to finally call home. Thank you. I have two more poems that I'd love to share with you. I think as we're doing all of this work, right, in preparation for the future, in preparation for the next generations, that we remember, why we are doing this work. And so this is a poem called A Prayer for Someday Children. Those children for me are not just yet. I have two cats. That's as far as it goes, you feel me? But, for the someday children, a poem. You who be descendant of both Haitian Revolution and survivor of Southern shackles, you who have the prayers of freedom fighters and joy lovers encamped about you, abolition baptized in your bloodstream, you, yes, you, my love, are the most tender miracle. A sunshine rainbow gathering glitter in the growing, our queer Black family, an unapologetic continuation of all that have come before, by bloodline and by choice, in spite of what we may not have received from those who did not have the capacity to live so freely, and especially because of ancestors who gave love in such abundance, you, my dear, my most sweet and nurtured dream, the hope and healing of tomorrow and today, you generational curse breaker, nap taker, wide-eyed wonder maker, crocodile tear faker. Please remember always, you matter, my love. As your parents, we model what loving out loud looks like, so you will never have to fear the judgment of your own shadow, nor hide from the deepest and most true parts of your heart that yearn to love without boundaries or borders. We choose to live openly and break chains honestly and free of inhibition. We define what family means. Craft space for our own liberation so that you will not be afraid to express your truest self in all your glory, nor dim your light for some ill-conceived convenience. There is no room for shame here. Only questions that eventually yield answers, only love that holds us tight and demands a call for justice as our given right. I pray that you know a world without police violence, racism, homophobia, xenophobia, misogyny, transphobia, the kind of hate that attempts to stamp out our people. This is why we fight. For all Black lives to matter. This is why we gave with all we got to ensure this place be safe harbor for you when you arrive. This is why we defunded the police and reimagined safety. This is why we created immigration policy and practice to care for you and try that we made to protect you, to hold you in our arms and on our backs. I know The world is waiting for you with a brick. Beloved, brilliant that you are. Some will attempt to cage your sun and call it night. Do not believe the lies. My dear, mon cœur, the very piece of me that lives and thrives and breathes and beams, know that when they try us, and they will, remember this prayer and affirmation. Our love is stronger than their fear. Our love sets us free. Do I have time for one more? How are you guys feeling? Sometimes I'm like, yes? How y'all feeling? It's like a day of creating real tangible change. I'm in such awe of the work you all are doing, and I'm so excited to hear more. I have one more poem to sort of leave some of my heart and story with you. Again, my name is Yasmine Monet Watkins, and thank you. Robin D.G. Kelly said, "What shall we build on the ashes of a nightmare?" That question prompted this poem. Let's just say when. Let's just say when the sun rises again and the birds call and sing the start of this new day that we have arrived. And when, from the rubble of devastation and set of fists and fear, this time, our hands stretch out to one another. Let's close open palms around open palms and pull each other up and out. I want only to believe, or rather, I know that this time we hug tight and refuse to let go, our arms wrapped around the other, similar yet different sorrow, warm on dusty cheek. I know that when we are there, face to face, smack and the shock of loss and hurt and the weight of all this heavy, that eye to eye, heart to heart, we'll recognize tears speak the same language. This life shit is hard. But by some miraculous stroke of luck, of wonder, of privilege, of possibility, we are still here with breath left in our lungs to still do something about it. So let's just say that the sun has risen, and now on this new dawn that we've been fighting for, that the people have food, and somewhere comes a clarion call of hope, of chance, that this time we can actually rebuild and organize and structure a world that allows for those to hunger to eat, for those who shiver to have shelter, for families to find each other, that those who hurt have healing, that our lives and our bodies are ours, that there too is space for community, family, romance, growth, laughter, adventure, rest, play. This time we can both lean and hold each other up. I have to believe that in this wide, wondrous world, that on the other end of the hurt and pain and the kind of sadness that will fold a body in half, that there too is room for joy, that there too is possibility, that there too the heart can burst full of wonder and awe and magic, and that when you hold my hand, that when we are here on the ashes of decisions not made for, from, or by us, that we can still choose today and each other. So let's just say out loud that somehow we make it to morning, and when it feels like all we've got is morning, let's just say yes, and somehow the seed of a miracle blooms. And from that endless ocean of tears, we water something new. I have to believe that we won't turn our backs on each other, but instead turn toward both of us, green on the dawn of possibility, that we can still build from that heart-centered place that knows love that knows care, that knows compassion, that knows there is still much to be repurposed, that not all is lost, and that our hearts still feel all of this. Because even still, dawn breaks, and somewhere a bird sings. Thank you.
Wow. Give it up one more time. That was excellent. Thank you so much, Yasmine. And you can follow her on Instagram, on Twitter. Check out the hashtags there. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our USC ERI's Turpanjian postdoc, Dr. Tai Lee. Tai earned his PhD in public policy and management in the USC Price School of Public Policy, where his research focused on issues of social equity. Tai's postdoc work takes a mixed method approach in exploring the immigrant integration landscape in California to identify strategies in mobilizing and organizing hard-to-reach immigrant population. Please give it up for Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Tabari, for that introduction. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we begin to discuss how California can move forward to be a more immigrant-inclusive state. My name is Tai Lei, and I am the Turpanjian Postdoctoral Fellow. And today I will be presenting data highlights on California's immigrant communities to provide a bit of context on how immigrants in the Golden State are doing. So as many of us here know, California has long had a reputation of being an immigrant-rich state, not only in its sheer numbers, but also the diverse countries of origin immigrants hail from. 30 years ago, the vast plurality of immigrants in California were from Mexico. But the share of Mexican immigrants to California has been on a steady decline. When we look at the immigrant cohort who have been in California for less than 10 years, there is much greater diversity. Though immigrants from Mexico still make up the largest share, we now see greater representation from countries like China, India, El Salvador, and other Central American countries. In examining race ethnicity by recency of arrival, we can see that among the most recent cohort of immigrants, the greatest share are Asian American at about 45%. Which is a shift from previous cohorts who mainly identify as Latinx or Hispanic. So along with California's racial ethnic diversity, the Golden State is also home to the largest population of undocumented immigrants in the United States. And what we find is that the vast majority of undocumented immigrants in California have been in the United States for at least a decade. So this is an important point to highlight, as their tenure in the country is indicative of their ties to their communities, socially, economically, and politically. There are approximately 2.4 million undocumented immigrants in California, many of whom live with close ties and family members, who are US citizens or lawful residents. So that means 14% of California's population is either undocumented or living with a family member who is. So though the Latinx community has the highest representation of undocumented immigrants and mixed status families, we see a significant and growing presence of undocumented immigrants and mixed status families who are Asian American. So overall, for the first time in its history, California's population is shrinking, including its immigrant population. So despite the increased immigrant share of the US population, we are seeing a declining share in California. We see less immigrants are moving to California in major metropolitan regions like Los Angeles and San Francisco, while immigrants who have been in California are moving to other regions and states like Texas because they are unable to stay and thrive in what we are seeing as an increasingly unaffordable state with limited economic opportunities for all immigrant communities. So a shrinking immigrant population is concerning, especially because immigrants are essential to California's economy. In particular, immigrants are overrepresented in essential sectors like agriculture, construction, and manufacturing. Though immigrants are 27% of the state's population and 33% of California's workforce, immigrants represent nearly 70% of agriculture workers, nearly 50% of workers in manufacturing, and more than 40% in construction. So the chart's a bit hard to see, but when we break it down by occupation, we see immigrants make up significant shares of essential workers, including about a third of healthcare practitioners, more than 40% of healthcare support, and more than 40% of food preparation and service. So we have to recognize how immigrants during this pandemic are overconcentrated in essential high risk and high contact work. For example, we see that nearly 40% of Black immigrants in California and almost 40% of Pacific Islander immigrants are in essential high risk work, compared to about 16% of US-born white Californians. California is also a hub for highly educated and trained H-1B visa holders, who we find are concentrated in the state's tech sector. What is interesting and worth uplifting is that though California is only 12% of the US population, we have more than 22% of the nation's H-1B visa holders. Despite immigrants' important role in California's economy, there are still barriers to economic inclusion. Immigrant wages are generally lower than US-born Californians, even when disaggregated by race and gender. By race, white immigrants and Asian American immigrants, median household incomes fall about $10,000 short of their US-born counterparts, whereas Latinx immigrants, median household income is about $15,000 less than US-born Latinx Californians. The exception are Black immigrants and Pacific Islander immigrants who have a higher median household income than their US-born counterparts. By gender, immigrant men in California have a median hourly wage about $8 less than US-born men, and immigrant women's median hourly wage is about $5 less than US-born women in the state. We see the greatest wage disparities when we disaggregate our data by status. Overall, immigrants have a median hourly wage about $7 less than US-born Californians. However, this gap is primarily driven by undocumented immigrants who, at $13.11, have a median hourly wage about half of US-born Californians. So this translates into other startling statistics. Even if employed full-time, undocumented immigrants are significantly more likely to experience working poverty. 9% of US-born full-time workers in California are experiencing working poverty compared to nearly 45% of undocumented immigrants working full-time. So facing poverty and being underemployed presents other challenges, especially in California's increasingly unaffordable housing market. About 57.5% of immigrant householders face rent burden compared to 51.8% of US-born householders in California. Disaggregated by status, 65.1% of undocumented householders are rent burdened. So with poverty and increasing housing costs, immigrants are also more likely to live in overcrowded housing, which can create detrimental health and social problems. So again, we see the most striking data point for undocumented households. 1.5% of US-born Californians live in overcrowded housing, whereas 13.4% of undocumented immigrants in the state do. We also find immigrants are also more likely to face conditions to be excluded from civic activities and engagement. At more than 25%, immigrant-headed households are significantly more likely to be linguistically isolated, meaning no one in the household who is 14 or older speaks English very well. Again, we see greater barriers for households headed by undocumented immigrants at 38%. So during a time when we have become increasingly reliant on information communication technology for teleworking, telelearning, telehealth, it's concerning that such a high share of Californians are still lacking access to computing devices and quality broadband. We see that the group most likely to suffer from the digital divide are undocumented immigrants at 47.7%. So California is also home to a significant size of immigrants who are eligible to naturalize, but have yet to do so. In California, we estimate there are 2.2 million Californians who are eligible to become citizens, with the vast majority who are Latinx and a sizable share who are Asian American. The rate of naturalization is rather stark when disaggregated by race ethnicity. 58.5% of eligible Latinx immigrants have naturalized, which is significantly lower than other groups. In another study, we explore some of the mechanisms contributing to this disparity and find challenges associated with the cost of the naturalization process and chilling effects exacerbated by the criminalization and enforcement of undocumented immigrants who, as mentioned previously, live in mixed status homes with immigrants who are eligible to become citizens. As an immigrant-rich state, California has relatively more progressive attitudes toward its immigrant communities. For example, a March 2021 survey by the Public Policy Institute of California finds that about 85% of adults support a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. The survey also showed that 75% of adults support tax-paid healthcare for all, including undocumented immigrants. But such warm attitudes are not reflected in reality. Undocumented immigrants are significantly lacking health insurance coverage, despite many policies and advocates demanding health for all. We see that 35.6% of undocumented immigrants do not have health insurance coverage, compared to 5.3% of US-born Californians. So when we disaggregate this data by age, the gap is most stark for older undocumented immigrants. 71% of undocumented immigrants aged 65 and older do not have health coverage, which is concerning considering the barriers to a healthy life at the intersection of age and status. So it's worth noting, however, that California has recently passed historic legislation to expand Medi-Cal coverage to more undocumented adults. But without truly universal healthcare, hundreds of thousands of undocumented immigrants will likely remain uninsured because they do not meet Medi-Cal's annual income requirements for most adults, despite experiencing working poverty. So unlike other low-income immigrants with lawful status, undocumented immigrants do not have the immediate option to get subsidized coverage through Covered California. So despite California's warm attitudes and its declaration as a sanctuary state, we still see an increase in deportations originating in California. So this is concerning because of how it creates harm to undocumented immigrants and their families who rely on them for social and financial support. So we have much more to share about California's immigrant communities, and you can find them in 2 reports that are available online. The first is an issue report that has a summary of the findings and future scenarios we analyze with insights from immigrant advocates and community leaders. The second is the Facts, Origins, and Trends report with greater detailed findings and discussions on immigrant communities across California. So with that, I'll end my presentation and hand it to Dr. Manuel Pastor to introduce our esteemed panel and to moderate this very important conversation.
Great, we can have the panelists come on up. Everyone's so happy to see real human beings. I was at an event the other day and someone said, you're not as funny as you used to be. And I said, well, I just spent the last 2 years trying to not die. It had an effect on my sense of humor. But hope to bring it a little bit back today. First, I want to thank Dr. Taile for that presentation and for his leadership on this project. Let's give Ty a big round of applause. I also want to thank him for his bravery talking after Yasmine, Monet, Watkins, because that is a tough act to follow. Although, Yasmine, we like to think of data as poetry and graphs. So, and I do want to say that the report also tries to look a little bit forward to some of the trends that are occurring. For example, the changing composition of immigrant flows that Ty referred to, but the fact that so many of the folks who are now arriving are likely to be climate refugees or really refugees from violence. And so much of the framing of the past of immigrants as immediate economic contributors, that is not someone's value whether or not they contribute economically. Their value is that they are a human being. We also try to lift up the changing demography of the state, not just with regard to the changing view of our population, because currently we're about 62% people of color. In 40 years from now, we'll be 66% people of color. That's not a lot of change. But you know what's going to change? We're going to become an older state. And what most people think when they think about that, because of the past, is white people getting older, because that's who it's been, you white people. But what's going on is that the groups that are getting older are Latinos and Asians and Black folks in the state. And with the racial wealth divide casting a lack of assets for that population, tough challenges going forward. So one of the things we try to talk about in the report is that this has been a state which has sometimes been all talk, very little action. Like we pat ourselves in the back for being progressive and no longer being the kind of state that passes something like Proposition 187. But have we fully addressed the economic and structural issues that will actually allow immigrants to succeed? And in the course of doing this research for this report, one of the people we talked to offered a striking observation. And the striking observation was that the state seems to have a strategic plan around climate change. And it's got very specific goals about when we go to all electric vehicles as part of the new cars sold, about how far GHGs, greenhouse gas emissions, are going to go down. But what would it mean to have a strategic plan around immigrant inclusion that sets metrics, sets goals, and sets strategies? And I want to thank our informants for suggesting our next panel, which is this panel. And we have great panelists. I'll be quick in the introductions because if you know this world, you know them quite well. Cynthia Buissa is the executive director of the California Immigrant Policy Center, where she works with others and other groups to provide really the vision for immigrant integration for the state. She is also just a marvelous human being and an ally who's been supportive at every turn of the research that we do, and often suggesting research we should do that we then immediately respond to. Thank you, Cynthia, for being here, for being always at our back, and for constantly suggesting our next research project. Round of applause. Gina de Silva is the Senior Policy Advisor for Immigration in the Office of Governor Gavin Newsom, but she really hails from the world of nonprofits, having been the Director of Government Affairs at CIPC, where she played a central role on the One California Immigration Services funding and all sorts of other things. She is the consummate insider because she has been the consummate outsider and a perfect reflection of how we need to both put people who we know are solid in government, but also how they need to be supported by our outside organizations. A round of applause for Gina de Silva. No panel would be complete without Jesus Martinez. He is the executive director of the Central Valley Immigrant Integration Collaborative, which is totally cool because the acronym is CIVIC. This is a Fresno County-based nonprofit, which is really trying to create a voice for immigrants throughout the Central Valley. And one of the things that Jesus and CIVIC have done is remind us that the interesting action for change around immigrants doesn't just occur in Los Angeles and in the Bay Area. And if you're looking at the data that Ty was hinting at, where our immigrant population is actually growing, Central Valley. And where the children are growing, it's the Central Valley. That's the part of the state that's got the highest share of children. In contrast to, for example, the city of San Francisco, which currently, and this is true, now has more dogs than children. So if you wanted to invest in our future and for it not to be poodles, you might actually want to be working in the Central Valley. Round of applause for Jesus Martinez. Next, my good colleague, Dr. Karthik Ramakrishnan. He's the professor of public policy at the University of California, Riverside, and the executive director of California 100, which is the project that commissioned these reports. He is a dear friend. He is a brilliant analyst, and he is a consummate immigrant because he has 3 or 4 jobs at the same time. Big round of applause for Karthik Ramakrishnan. Masih Fouladi is the Deputy Executive Director of the Los Angeles chapter of CARE, the Council on American-Islamic Relations. Masih has 10 years of advocacy experience working to protect the civil rights of the African, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian communities. But how I've gotten to know him as someone who speaks for all immigrants and who recognizes the intersectionality of struggles, understanding that what's good for the Muslim community is what will be good for all immigrant communities and for all of California, and that what's good for other immigrant communities, for our Black communities, for our working class communities in the state will also be good to protect the rights of Muslims. Let's welcome Masih. And finally, someone who I hope you know how special you are to me, Ramla. Ramla Sahid is the executive director of the Partnership for Advancement of New Americans in San Diego. She's received numerous awards for her work with PANA, including the 2017 Women of the Year Award, 2017 Global Citizen Award from the United Nations Association of USA, and the Muslim Champion Award from the Islamic Center of San Diego. But this is just, I really pride myself on being able to meet people when nobody yet knows who they are. And I got a chance to meet you when you were really just up and coming. And the special spark in your vision, in your ability to move people, your ability to build bridges, and apparently today, when you faced childcare issues, the ability to demand that your husband provide childcare. Absolutely, hope he's listening, absolutely inspirational. Meet one of our, if you haven't met her before, future star leaders, already a star leader here in the state of California, Ramla Sahid. So I want to start actually with Karthik. Karthik, if you could say a word about the California 100 project and how it's trying to talk about an ideal future for California, and then have others talk about their ideal future around this issue of immigrant inclusion.
Thank you, Manuel. And just amazed to be on this panel with movers and shakers in their various spheres. California 100, one way to think about it, many of you may have heard about the Future of Work Commission from a couple of years ago, thinking about the future of employment and economic mobility, workforce development, and the like. Think of this as the Future of Everything Commission. It is not a public commission, although we do have public servants among our advisors. But we are trying to think about the long-term future of California and to make sure that it is successful. And what does success look like? Often the standard metrics of success would be things like GDP, would be things like wealth, the number of unicorns, which are like billion-dollar valuated companies, et cetera. But we know that those are not the ideal measures of success. They could be among the measures of success. But there's so much else that we need to pay attention to. How do we make sure that California remains a state of innovation and a state of inclusion? That's the core of what we're trying to do. We have 20 research partners throughout the state. We have 13 issue areas that have now become 15 issue areas. it's a bit dizzying with all of the research that's coming down the pike. But it's also very rewarding. Cynthia Buiza is one of our commissioners who has strong expertise in immigrant integration, immigrant inclusion for sure, but also has interests in other issue areas. And this is true of all of our commissioners. How can we do this work that recognizes the intersectionality across issues and interdependence across issues? And how do we envision, one metaphor that I use is most parts of California, you can see the mountains at least on clear days. How do we envision what that summit looks like and make sure that everyone gets there together? And how do we find the pathways to get there? That's what we're trying to do. And we are so thrilled to have Manuel and Ty as our research partners on the immigrant integration part of the work. But none of this will happen if we don't enlist a whole bunch of other partners. And that's what we look forward to doing in the next year and a half.
Great, thanks. And Karthik is happy to have me and Ty for a variety of reasons, I'm sure, but partly because of the 40 academics we turned in our report on time. So mostly due to Ty, but anyway. Cynthia, you've worked really hard on this issue of an immigrant future, and along with others, have really helped push us from immigrant integration to immigrant inclusion. Can you talk about the difference between those two terms and what you think of as the future we should be heading for?
Yep. Thank you, Manuel and ERI for inviting us. And it's a privilege to be with these friends and colleagues in this important conversation, as well as on Immigrant Day. So on the other side of the internet is Immigrant Day of Action 2022 happening, about 700 people actually asking for what we are asking for today. The pivot towards the use of immigrant inclusion just came very naturally to us because it has been a powerful conversation that's existed in the national immigrant rights movement. There's the idea of integration has been fraught for a while because it seems to have the notion of forcing people to do something without their willingness or their will. Whereas as we move towards the idea of a for-all state, it seemed just to make sense to use this word. Again, there was no big debate like other terminologies that we sometimes get stuck in the movement. Just for a lot of our fellow advocates, it seemed like a term that everybody actually also wanted to adopt, that it landed softly, easily. People accepted it. There was no further conversation when we started using the word inclusion. And I know there are technical definitions that exist out there, but I'm not going to spend time on that because the more important question you're asking is what is the ideal immigrant inclusion of future for us? For CIPC and a lot of our partners in the advocacy community, that future, that ideal future isn't going to happen if we do not address the current barriers that exist for many immigrants to live a basic life of dignity. And I spoke about this in the forum we had last night, which is let us finish the job of addressing those fundamental human needs that every person in California needs to survive and thrive: food, shelter, healthcare, the sense of community, the feeling that they belong, because human needs don't distinguish between immigrant and a native-born Californian. So if we get past that, we will remove this two-tier of existence that we have subjected many immigrants in California for a long time. Two system of justice, two system of healthcare, two system of food and housing. So let's eradicate that, and then we can get to this place where we're moving into the other issues that Ty mentioned earlier around housing, the digital divide, and the future of migration, which is becoming very complicated as our global conflicts and climate-induced migration worsens.
Great, and I want to turn now to Ramla at the end of the table to talk a little bit about how you see the future, and I'm particularly interested, if you would, to talk about refugees. I feel like in California, and I've been guilty of this mistake, there are so many people who are immigrants in the non-refugee kind of space that we forget to understand. I think California has the most refugees of any state, and that's probably going to step up with the climate crisis, wars, et cetera. Anyway, your future and that important issue.
Absolutely. Thank you, Manuel, and thank you, Cynthia, for all the comments you mentioned, just around the need for, for families to be afforded dignity, and that's very true when it comes to resettlement. I think, I'm gonna open my phone so I don't get the facts wrong. Numbers are important. We remember Trump's, policies and how that really dismantled, right, the refugee program. Biden comes into office, raises the refugee cap, albeit with some resistance, to 125,000 a year. And today we are, we've basically resettled about 9,000 people, right? And that just goes to show how vulnerable and how unpredictable, right, our existing protections are. And California can't afford to be relying on the federal government to lead on immigration. That's the bottom line. San Diego, where I'm from and where my communities are from, has one of the busiest border crossings in the entire country, right? And arguably one of the busiest in the world. And so we can't afford to sit around and let the federal government lead on this. And immigration is multifaceted, it's very complicated. And because we've, at the federal level, seen a dismantling of the refugee program, the new administration, Biden's administration, is trying to find ways to be responsive to new crises, new violence, right? And so we've got these new terms that we're trying to, they're not new terms, but they're new to our communities, right? Understanding these immigration reliefs that they're offering, humanitarian parole, SIV, special immigrant visa, the response to Ukraine, and there's a lot of conversation about, like, okay, we see the blatant anti-blackness that exists within our immigration policies at the border and with the federal refugee resettlement program. And we also see how global foreign policy really drives our immigration. And so as California, right, being one of the states with the largest number of immigrants and refugees, how do we make sure our families are able to thrive? Because at the end of the day, there are families, period, right? And it isn't enough, right? We need to go beyond this idea, because there is a fragmentation, I would say, in the immigrant community where, refugees are kind of forgotten about because they have legal status technically, right? And have some financial support. But when you dig into the research, and we do a biennial House meeting report that's on our website, you see that having legal status doesn't actually mean you get, quality schools or healthcare or, housing. The families are literally homeless on day one of being resettled. Literally, people are in motel rooms, and PANA has been fighting to kind of figure out how to keep people housed, right? And so that can't be the future we continue. And so for me, California, a future for California that has inclusion for all of our families, is a California that's actually leading on this issue and not responding.
Y'all see what I mean? Masih, I'm wondering if you might pick up on this kind of set of issues too. What does the future look like? And in particular, I know in our conversations, Ramla was talking about how anti-blackness has colored our policies. Islamophobia has, when you think even now about the sort of welcome for Ukrainian refugees, and yet so many fleeing violence that is at least as bad in the Middle East are not finding welcomes on the part of the federal government, and California could lead on some of that. But anyway.
Thank you, Manuel. And yeah, it's always hard to speak after Ramla. What I appreciate about today is the fact that we're thinking about strategy and forward thinking, because so often our communities have to be reactive. to everything, and it almost always seems like we're underfunded, under-resourced. And when we're thinking about the future of California, the future for immigrants that's equitable, I think funding is a huge component of that at the state level, at the federal level, at the county and city levels. And we're in like a very unique place in time with coming out of the pandemic, where there's historic levels of funding coming from the federal government that can uplift our communities. But what we kind of have to get our minds around is the diversity of the immigrant community. And that's what I loved about your presentation, because that's what you're highlighting, the diversity of the Muslim, of the immigrant community, and the Muslim community is a part of that immigrant community. And to Manuel's point, global Islamophobia has, and conflict internationally has really led to large numbers of Muslim immigrants coming to the United States. But the other thing that really is influencing some of that global Islamophobia is even the rhetoric and Islamophobia we see in the United States by the previous administration, by many on the right, that fuels this type of global Islamophobia, where we have folks in, again, India, and Uyghur Muslims, Rohingya Muslims, who can't really do anything in their lives. They're having their storefronts set on fire. They can't go to the mosque. They can't celebrate Ramadan, and they're relying really on American Muslim populations to provide support, to provide assistance, to provide advocacy. And so with the recent influx of Afghan arrivals, for example, we've seen the governor's office, we've seen CDSS step up in really historic ways to provide support. Obviously, we need more support, and when we are reactive, you kind of need to, and that's the component of being equitable, right? When you're starting from behind, you need to catch up, and then you need an influx of investment to be able to get to where others have been. And I think that's where we're at right now in the Muslim community, understanding that we're playing catch up. There's so much hurt, there's so much trauma, there's so many systemic issues that we're facing, not only from an immigration perspective, but then also always being securitized and seen as a threat that our community has to deal with. And that's why, again, to Manuel's point and introduction, the intersectionality of the work that we do with the Hispanic, Latinx community, with the Black immigrant community is so important, because for years, those communities have had to experience the same kind of issues that we have. And so that's kind of why I try to be mindful of, now that we are in this historic opportunity coming out of the pandemic, how do we make sure to be as inclusive as possible? And how do we continue to demand more, knowing that we're not being unreasonable, but we're playing catch up? And so when we have the LA Justice Fund, for example, here in LA, and folks are telling you, wow, like $8 million for a legal defense fund, that's amazing. And then you hear about, well, we have historic levels of folks who aren't naturalized that need to be naturalized, and $8 million gets us nowhere. We shouldn't feel bad about continuing to push the envelope.
Thank you. And yeah, a lot of applause and what the young people do. It's just another, I mean, in some sense, with the last couple of interventions, we're talking about communities that sometimes don't get seen. And I think that that's also true for the Central Valley, that there's oh yeah, there's a lot of immigrants there, they pick food, isn't that great? But not understanding what communities there need. Can you talk to us a little bit about your work, about your own experience with strategic planning and what you see as the future for immigrants, particularly in the Central Valley?
Thank you, Manuel, and thank you all the team members who helped make this event possible. When we talk about the Central Valley, it's a place that many of us do not want to live in or do not know much about. I spent 30 years living in San Jose and had gone to the Central Valley maybe 2 or 3 times before I actually moved there in 2000. And since I lived there now over 20 years, when I talk with friends and colleagues about the possibility of moving elsewhere for one thing or another, I tell them that I really don't have any interest in moving out, because I really come to like the Central Valley a lot, to enjoy working with many different types of organizations that work with immigrants and so on and so forth. Now, a good chunk of my own family members live in the Fresno area also. And when we talk about these issues that Manuel brought in this question, when we met, Manuel, Pastor, and a team of his coworkers were invited to work with us in 2013 to help put together a strategic plan that we needed in order to try to respond to the possibility of some comprehensive immigration reform being adopted. You might recall, those of you who are old enough, that in 2013, the Senate did pass a comprehensive immigration reform, and we had been working the previous months in trying to promote DACA among the Central Valley, because USCIS officials who had visited Fresno in early 2014, January 2014, informed us at that point in time that the Central Valley had the lowest rate of DACA applications in the nation, despite the fact that there were a good number of DACA eligible applicants. But we realized when we began to work in a very small scale DACA project that there were several issues that were influencing why so few people were applying for DACA. And one of those was almost non-existent legal services infrastructure, nonprofit legal service infrastructure. There were only 8 or 9 accredited representatives in the entire Central Valley, a region that had 900,000 immigrants, according to Manuel's research at that point in time.
Which means it's right.
So it was an abysmal legal landscape, nonprofit legal landscape. And if we were thinking then of preparing the Central Valley for some comprehensive immigration reform down the line, whether it was a few months or 5 years down the line, then we had to build that infrastructure and develop a different model of working. So we ended up over the years developing a model of regional coordination and collaboration that was based on a strategic plan that Manuel and his team helped us identify. So we identified 4 major priorities and built this regional collaborative along those major priorities. We have, instead of having 8 or 9 accredited representatives, and at that point in time, we also developed a directory of legal services providers. It was 1 page long. Nowadays, it's 7 pages long with all kinds of different organizations, either being established in the Central Valley or, very importantly, also satellite offices being established by agencies based in LA or San Francisco. So that has transformed, improved the landscape. But to go back very quickly to one of the key points that Manuel has pointed out, the Central Valley, I think we're still operating and working in a reactive mode. As a couple of my colleagues have also mentioned, reacting to the challenges, to problems, to the lack of infrastructure, building to catch up, as has also been mentioned here. So when we think about the future, what future do we imagine? What's our ideal future? For the Central Valley, it also means for the Central Valley immigrants, acknowledging that it is a diversifying immigrant population, as has been documented in the reports today and also in the comments of my colleagues, which means that in order to adequately address the needs, the interests, the rights of that diversifying immigrant population, we have to develop the capacity, organizational capacity, community capacity, and also engage the local governments in building that future we want to desire. And in the Central Valley, we find a political environment where the local governments, where political power is still not very immigrant friendly, to say the least. So the transformation, the ideal future that we want to build, from my perspective, also has to include ensuring that we create a democracy that is inclusive, that allows immigrants of whatever immigration status they have to participate and to promote, like other colleagues have also mentioned, the naturalization of immigrants who are eligible, which means also building the infrastructure to make that possible. So we can.
Great, thanks. I want to turn to Gina, and by the way, this is a fantastic panel, which means no matter really what I ask, people will say what they want. So, but let me ask this and see whether it strikes a chord, which is, what would it's hard sometimes for government to look long-term at issues, and yet there's the climate stuff we're doing. There's the Economic Resilience Fund that's trying to look long-term at regional economic development. There are instances. What do you see as a immigrant-inclusive future, and what's the sort of ways in which we could think about the state actually developing a strategic plan, and the way in which outside organizations could be helpful about creating the desire for one.
A few questions in that one.
Yeah, You get the next 45 minutes. Go ahead. So,
Feel free to remind me if I missed one. Well, thank you all. It's incredible to be here. I know all these lovely people on the panel. I have had the opportunity to have many conversations with them. And truly, I look back at the last 3 years and think, wow, I know there's a lot more to do. There's always more to do, and especially coming out of COVID. But it really is historic and amazing just what we've been able to achieve together, because it truly, to Manuel's point, is together. It's the governor, it's the legislature, it's community engagement in the process, and really prioritizing and helping us think through some issues that are, quite frankly, not very straightforward oftentimes. I think for me, I had the opportunity to come from an organization that worked on so many different policy areas, and from my own personal experience, immigrant integration is very much a question of fair policy, and to Cynthia's point, belonging. I think it's more than just what we can legislate and what we can do within state government. I think it's much broader conversation with community. But for me specifically, it's when I look at everything that the state of California can do and should do and wants to do, where are immigrants in every single policy? How is immigration status or being foreign born no longer a factor to your opportunity or your safety or your well-being in the state of California? I really think of it quite holistically, because I think, to Manuel's point, there are so many challenges in front of us: climate, the economy. And so we really need to think about where are we looking at immigrants across the spectrum, and then where are we looking at tailored opportunities to really advance a strategy. And I'm really proud to say that I think, after having gone through so much in these last 3 years as a state government, both because of COVID, but quite frankly, immigration events that occurred under both administrations, right, the prior and the current, that have been really challenging for state government, but an incredible opportunity for us to think about the long term, and for us to think about where is the state's the state's role really best served, given that there are gaps across the board when we look at the national level, right, across the board. And so in the budget, in the governor's budget this year, what you'll see is a little bit more of starting to pull together what we've built over the last few years of expanding access to government programs regardless of immigration status, both programs that exist and programs that are new. So having universal TK, right? Rent relief regardless of immigration status. Everything is regardless of immigration status that we have pushed in the last few years around relief and responding to needs and thinking about childcare and all of these other important issues. Also, expanding, as I mentioned, expanding eligibility, working on implementation, but also thinking very specifically about the opportunities to address poverty and thinking about low-income immigrants specifically, but also the opportunity to think about immigrants as driving success and growth in the state of California. Immigrant workers, immigrant entrepreneurs, where are we making sure that we're really thinking about those opportunities to break open pipelines of talent, and really making sure that we start to build a strategy around how we think about where are the opportunities for the state to invest in immigrant integration and inclusion, particularly within the lens of equity. There's so much important equity work that's happening right now during the administration. I think that COVID really allowed us to drill into a lot of hard conversations and thinking about what we're doing well and what where we need to improve. And so I do think, there's a number of proposals in the budget that really take that head on. All of our climate investments are really focused on vulnerable communities, workers that are disproportionately impacted, extreme heat, just thinking about the future and trying to see where we can continue to drive community partnerships, targeted policies around vulnerable communities, and learning particularly from the lessons of COVID, of census, and where we use data to help us be as sharp as possible. But we can only be as sharp as we can with data, because at the end of the day, it comes down to partnerships on the ground, working with all of you to make sure that we implement well and that we are learning from our implementation as we look forward.
that's great. And I think it starts to give an interesting parallel, because when you look at the climate investments in the budget, they're kind of bunched together and you can see what they are. And I think how we lift that up around the immigrant spending. And the other thing I think you're saying that's really crucial is that immigrant inclusion is more than what we've thought about as traditional immigration issues. So very, very important. We are going to give everybody one last pass to say something. And Karthik was frantically writing down, I think, the volume 3 of Capital here. So you're first, but quick.
Okay, I'll do it quick. We need to think way into the future, right? So one thing I didn't mention, that the 100 in California 100 means 100 years. It also means, how do we make California 100? So what does perfection look like? And how do we give California our 100, right? We need to go all in here. So there are things, very, very important things that we think of as transformative, that have happened already in the last decade, that are happening now. But let's think really, really big, right? There was a time in the United States where you had states that gave non-US citizens the right to vote on state constitutions for US members of Congress. Now that went away in World War I. Now under federal law, there's some limitations, but there's a lot that we can do within California to expand the right to participate and be represented. I'll plug my book very quickly. I should have brought copies of my book here, Manuel, on state citizenship. Now that's a kind of concept that would seem very radical today, but we've seen what's happened in other movements when you have a kind of ideal set of benchmarks that you lay down and think about a 30, 50, 100-year strategy to get there. So we talk about 5 dimensions of rights. It's very, and I was also really moved by what Cynthia said about saying no to 2 systems, right? And this notion of one California. I also say, in addition to these rights, I think we have to ground ourselves in what does it mean to be a Californian, and to think of that as the fundamental political membership and civic and social membership in California that we need to uphold. So we talk about the right to free, this is with Alan Colburn, the right to free movement. What does that look like? And that varies according to all sorts of stereotypes that law enforcement, but even everyday citizens of California have. The right to due process and legal protection. How can we go all out in our current constitutional framework at the federal and state level to get it done? The right to develop human capital, very aligned with what Cynthia was talking about, basic human needs, but going beyond those basic human needs, the kind of things anyone needs to thrive in this society. The right to participate and be represented, and then finally, the right to identify and belong. We've made progress, when it comes to driver's licenses, for example, but there's so much more to go. All sorts of markers that still exist. And it's not just about those who are undocumented versus not. And it's also not just those who are native born versus foreign born. It's those who are Black, those who have other visible markers that mark them for discrimination and feel like they don't belong. So there's a lot to be done. And thank you, Manuel, for teeing up this conversation, because we do really need to imagine things that, in our wildest dreams that we could not accomplish this year, but we should be aiming for in the next decade or more.
Very visionary. And Cynthia, I know you're both visionary and practical. How do we get there? What are the next steps?
Wow. Well, it's so heartening to hear the alignment in the panel, and I can imagine in the room, because as I was listening, I really was thinking that one, all of these accomplishments that we have now, including the ones that Gina is talking about, that we're moving towards, we gotta protect it with all our might. So I keep talking about resilient infrastructures, so that wherever the political winds go, that's not taken away, because if they are, for the length of time it took to get them, that's the length of time it's gonna take us again to get them back, right? So let's figure out a way, and there's time to talk about that, but how do we make those infrastructures stick around? The other is really examining how we fully explore and mobilize immigrant power, because I think that is one area where we are gaining a lot of ground, but I also am aware, we work with political accountability organizations where our communities are also low propensity voters, especially the naturalized ones. If we want the kind of political makeup that we have in Sacramento to stick around, we need to mobilize people to deploy their political power to make that happen. And lastly, and I haven't said this before, but to the extent that many of us are connected in many ways to different movements, but also to the immigrant rights movement, let's examine the ways in which we are our own obstacles to addressing these gaps, right? And I know there's room enough to have those conversations about where are we not putting resources in? Where is there so much competition versus cooperation and collaboration among social impact immigrant rights organizations, and how are we drawing in the resources so that the philanthropic sector, the state government, and us are pulling towards this vision of integration that my friends and colleagues have already talked about? You wanted practical.
Very, but visionary too. Masih, what is this conversation stirring for you? And do you find some kernels of hope, at least in this alignment?
Definitely lots of hope and really wanting to move towards action. I think Cynthia just kind of touched upon the components of really when you want to do system change, you need to organize folks. You need to have a narrative shift to be able to do that. And I think what I've seen in times of crisis, whether it was when working with Somali refugees, or working with Syrian asylees, now working with Afghan arrivals and Uyghur Muslims and Rohingya Muslims, is the more we set up our infrastructures to respond to crisis, but also understand the possible obstacles that can come about going forward and really get in front of them, the better we position ourselves. And I think the partnership with state, local government, and with philanthropy is going to be huge in those conversations, because like I said, we're playing catch up. And to be able to do that narrative change, to do the system change, we're going to need to strategize for what 100 years from now is going to look like, but also understand that, to Cynthia's point, when you have the victories, you're still going to have to deal with obstacles. And I'll kind of just share a quick personal story before turning it back over to you, Manuel. Even with the real IDs, right? A couple months ago, after all of the extensions on having an expired ID kind of went away because COVID, we're kind of going back into the world, I went to the DMV just to get my driver license and brought my passport and everything and submitted it to the guy. And he's like, oh, give me a second, I need to go talk to my supervisor. He comes back like 10 minutes later, and he was like, we're having a problem verifying your passport. I'm like, it's like in front of you, like, what are you having problems verifying? It's like, yeah, it's gonna take us a couple of weeks to get you your ID. Like 4 months later, I finally got my driver license in the mail, and it's because I was born in Iran, right? I have a passport, but on the inside of it, it says I was born in Iran. Anytime I go to the airport, anytime I go to the DMV, the first thing that comes up is, oh, you're a naturalized immigrant from Iran. We need to take a better look into this, right? And so like, as we're fighting for our rights, and thankfully, I have the right to participate civically and engage, the reality is we're still, in many ways, those second-class citizens, and we need to think about, at a federal level, at a state level, at local level, how do we make sure that our immigrant community is experiencing that going forward?
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that too. And actually also for lifting up this very important point of anticipating backlash. Sometimes we think we're making progress and we forget that there's the possibility of regress, or we imagine a utopian future without visualizing the fight that's going to be necessary to get there, both about building community power and limiting the power of others over communities. So thank you for those points. Gina, any last words, particularly about the role of the state in helping to achieve a more immigrant-inclusive future?
Yeah, I think one thing I neglected to mention, I think will be really important to the point that Manuel is making, is resources to create a new position within the governor's office of business and economic development on their international and trade team to coordinate immigrant integration conversations across state government. I think we've seen incredible opportunity just within the government around public charge and the multiple threats that have come our way, to think about how can we have more conversations within state government to advance awareness, understanding, really think about how people can really see immigrants within their policies and within their portfolios, and how does that expand opportunities to collaborate with the federal government, expand opportunities to collaborate with local governments. We have some incentive seed funding there as well to prioritize building out relationships with local government. But also I wanted to raise, I think, you have to have the federal, state, and local. I think the international piece is increasingly part of the conversation because of the changing world, but also resources. I mean, we can regress, and we also are in times when we have less resources available. And so I think it still comes down to there are really big conversations about where the federal government is rebuilding and where states are filling roles that are traditionally the role of the federal government, and where that hurts and maybe helps us sometimes. And just having honest conversations. I think resettlement is a big conversation that we all need to have that is bigger than the traditional system and really incorporates more the border. A state like California has to have a strategy around thinking about these issues at the border. This governor, I would dare to say, is the first and only California governor that has really targeted resources to the border, really thought about border strategies that are actually in his budget as well. And I think, a lot of times the border is not part of the conversations that I have with folks at the state level. So I think more opportunities to be inclusive, more opportunities to partner, coordinate, and to think about the long term.
Great. And Jesus, any last thoughts from you? In particular, you're in a place where there is very active backlash, and trying to navigate that in a less welcoming environment. What lessons are you learning? What do we need to be thinking about as we move forward?
Well, I have two thoughts that I'd like to share in this opportunity. One of them is that I think we have to think of immigration, international migration, as something that is ongoing. It's part of our reality. It's going to be part of our future as well, because of structural factors, because of the climate change, because of wars, or whatever the case may have been. Mobility of humans from one place to another has been part of our history since forever. So I think that's going to continue, and several factors are going to influence this migration in the future. In the case of Mexican migration to the US, for example, the US and Mexican economies have been integrated since the end of the 19th century. It has been formalized by NAFTA, has been also facilitated by other types of programs, including the Bracero program that awarded 4.5 million temporary jobs to Mexicans and created a tradition that had begun decades earlier. So that migration from Mexico may also be influenced down the line by climate change as well. It is being influenced right now by violence related to drug trafficking and drug cartels in Michoacan and many other places. So that's part of the reality, and it's going to be part of our future. International migration is part of our reality, and it's going to be part of our future. So as citizens, as government representatives, we have to acknowledge that and be prepared for whatever is going to be taking place. But also, as an immigrant myself, and as a member of a family that has a very long tradition of migration to the US since the early 20th century, one of the things I think that we also need to ask ourselves is, what do the immigrants themselves want to do? What are their priorities? And I think that's something that we often forget. For many of them, over the course of Mexican migration history to the US, the major desire that they had was to work in the US for several months, return to their home community, and take advantage of the US dollar's impact on the Mexican peso to be able to purchase land, to build a home, establish a business, whatever the case may end up being. That return to the home community is a dream that is not always possible, particularly nowadays with the violence in places like Michoacan and elsewhere. But we do have, for example, right now, Ukraine. People were fleeing the war, and then days later you realize and find in the news that people are returning to Ukraine despite the fact that it's being invaded by Russia. And a war is taking place there, an invasion is taking place. Why do they return to Ukraine? Because they have family members there, because they cannot adapt to life in Poland or wherever it is that they went to. So we also have to ask ourselves, of the different types of immigrants that we work with, what are their personal family goals? Every day we run into people who have passed away for whatever reason, and they want to send their body back to Mexico with their family members, to their community. Why do they want to bury the family member in Mexico or elsewhere for that matter? Because there are still strong ties. So we also have to think of immigrants still in many ways as transnational beings, people who have ties and roots in both places. It isn't just a national perspective that we have to adapt. In our case, one of the things that we did was develop also a transnational political movement of Mexican immigrants who wanted to influence democracy in Mexico, fight for the right to vote for Mexicans abroad. In the case of Michoacan, we created Secretaría de Migrantes. We approved the Michoacan right to vote from abroad, established municipal level migrant affairs office as a way of also transforming the homeland to respond to the reality of international migration and the way it adapts us. I think we also have to think transnationally, and not all solutions or responses to migration necessarily have to be domestic. They need to be also transnational, because international migration is by definition transnational.
Damn, Jesus, you're smart. So that's a really good point. And Rama, I'm gonna have you bring us home, and you can say whatever you want, but I'm kind of also wondering what gives you hope in this moment. I've always known you to be a hopeful person, a person who sees on the other side what is possible. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do today, is to see what is possible, be realistic about what stands in the way.
Absolutely, and I appreciate your realistic expectations of this beautiful panel. I think what gives me hope for the future is definitely, that panels like these and conversations like these are much more frequent. In terms of really being intentional about representing the full diversity that is the immigrants' rights movement. And we're not all the way there yet. For example, I think Dr. Pastor, you mentioned earlier, communities not seen, and just how important it is to remember that data can only get us so far, and the invisibility and triple invisibility of folks like me, for example, who came here as a refugee, right, is Black and is Muslim, right? And in the multiple ways in which, my brothers, for example, are impacted by immigration, criminal justice, poverty, all of these things. And so our communities are diverse, they're beautiful, they're complicated, right? And honoring that in more spaces is what gives me hope for the future. But it's also a barrier in that not enough of that is happening. I would say in terms of, while that might be happening in movement spaces, it's definitely not happened at policy tables, for example. And there is more conversation about it, and these issues are being brought up, but not in a way that I think really centers, Jesus, what you said, which is really important, centering the voices of people who are impacted, because only in understanding fully their lived experience can we tailor policies, practices, set metrics and strategies like Karthik mentioned, that actually produce better outcomes. And that is, I think, our path to creating a state. I'm going to paraphrase what you had said earlier and what Gina said, meld them together and say, to create a state of innovation, success, and growth, right? Not just a state where some of that is happening for some people, right? And it's really, again, centering those voices of impacted folks, making sure all of our spaces, panels, policy tables, conversations at the governor's office really do reflect the beautiful diversity that is California, so that we can get to the future that we need to get to.
Wow, that did give me hope, yeah. So let me just say a couple things to close, and then close me, and then Dr. Kim Tabori will close the session. And thanks to our online viewers, we're sorry we're running a little bit late, but we started a little bit late because it's in person. So I want to say that one of the biggest fundamental shifts that needs to occur is that California needs to realize that it needs to compete for immigrants. We've had lots of immigrants. Half of the immigrants coming to the United States in the 70s and 80s came to California, but now the share of foreign-born is declining. And when you think about all the assets of immigrants that are in this report, it's going to be a big mind shift for California to say, we need to figure out what that welcome mat is in order to get people to continue to come here. This is why I'm so glad Gina's been part of this conversation. I think the second thing that emerges from that is to recognize the full lives of immigrants and diversity that you are talking about, but that immigrants are willing to move to a state that thinks badly of them, like Texas, if they're able to buy a house there. And that until we address the housing affordability crisis, the economic inequality crisis, climate issues, et cetera, so the immigrant inclusion agenda really is the broad agenda of the state of California. And I think that's why I am so glad that we've been able to do this report and have this panel associated with California 100. You talked about different kinds of things that meant, 100 years, et cetera. The thing, keeping it 100, meaning trying to be real, I like that. But the other thing I think about is 100% of us. California for all of us. And to me, that's what California 100 really represents. Let's give this panel a big round of applause. And Dr. Kim Tabari to come and close us out.
Woo, thanks, Manuel. Wow, another round of applause. That was so awesome. I don't know if you all were taking notes. I was taking plenty of notes, so I'll be sending emails later. Thank you for engaging in this dialogue. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to the audience for your deep engagement, those of you that are in person and those of you that are online. You know, I just want to reiterate Ramla's last comment that hope is frequent conversations like this, right? That's representative of the immigrant community, visibilizing the communities, honoring our complexities, and really, as you said, creating a state of innovation for success and growth. So that was really beautifully said. Thank you again, Ramla, for that. And I want to quote every single one of you, but I know I don't have time, but you all were so amazing. Please note that our next event is the 2022 Future of Immigrants in LA, the in Los Angeles Summit, Justice, Power, and Intersections, happening in person on June 1st and 2nd. So look for more details on our social media for that. Thanks again to Dr. Taile, our Turpanjian postdoc, for his presentation and his rigorous work on the California 100 project, keeping it 100. Special thanks to the event planning team at ERI, Lauren, Emma, Sabrina, Carolina, Fernando, Manuel, Ty, Rhonda. Just from name tags to ordering food to organizing parking, all the behind the scenes things. Thank you so much. And lastly, we want to thank the Turpanjian Family Educational Foundation for their generous support and vision to endow the Civic Society and Social Change Chair and today's event. Everyone, please stay safe, stay healthy, and stay engaged in immigration work to uplift California and the nation. Thank you. Grab some food on your